Okay, so you know how sometimes you can understand English, like when you're watching a movie or something, but then when you actually have to speak, it's like your mind goes completely blank.
Oh, yeah, totally.
And it's like all those words,
Yeah.
you know,
Yep.
they just disappear.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're going to dive into today.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of people struggle with that, I think.
Yeah.
It's a really common thing, and especially, when you don't have consistent opportunities to practice
Yeah.
speaking with somebody.
Right.
It's like, how do you actually get better if you're not speaking?
Right.
And so that's kind of the challenge we're looking at today.
Okay, so we're looking at this conversation between Alex and Sophie. And Alex is kind of the person who's experiencing this problem.
Yeah, he's like the example learner that we're kind of following along with
Okay.
in this scenario. And he's basically saying, I understand English, but speaking is so much harder.
Yeah, and he hits on this really common thing. It's like, to get better at speaking, I need someone to speak with.
Yes, exactly. It's that assumption that you need a partner
Okay.
to actually practice and improve your speaking.
And Sophie's kind of pushing back against that a little bit.
Yeah, she challenges that assumption right from the start. She's like, hold on a second, maybe that's the first hurdle we need to overcome.
Interesting. Okay, so.
That idea that you absolutely need somebody else there
Yeah.
might be what's holding you back.
Okay, so how does she kind of test this idea out with him?
So she does this really smart thing. She gives him this quick on the spot test. She's like, okay, Alex, tell me about your day yesterday.
Oh, so simple, but
So simple, but so revealing.
yeah.
And Alex says, yesterday I go to the park and I was playing football with my friend.
And immediately,
Like a light bulb moment, right?
yeah,
Because it highlights this grammatical point.
yeah.
He uses the present tense go instead of the past tense went, which he should have used because he's talking about yesterday.
So even though he knows the words,
Exactly. He has the vocabulary. He understands the concept. But when it comes to actually speaking it fluently,
right.
the grammar trips him up.
And that's the whole point, isn't it? That's why she gave him that little test. It's to highlight that even if you know the rules in your head, putting them into practice in real time is a completely different thing.
Exactly. And that's where these solo practice techniques become so valuable.
Okay, so what's the first thing she kind of encourages him to do differently?
So her first piece of advice is all about shifting your mindset, and specifically shifting to thinking directly in English
Oh,
rather than constantly translating from your native language.
okay. So instead of thinking in, say, Spanish and then translating to English.
Yeah, exactly. Because that translation process, it slows you down, and it often leads to sentences that sound unnatural or a bit forced.
Right, right. Because you're not really thinking in the natural flow of English. You're thinking in the flow of another language.
It's like you're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Okay, but I can imagine some people listening to this and being like, well, that's easier said than done. How do I actually start thinking in English?
Well, Alex has that same reaction. He's like, but that's so hard. My brain automatically thinks in my native language. Like, how do I change that?
Okay, so what does she say?
So Sophie proposes this really simple but effective exercise. She gives him a word. In this case, it's the word rain.
Okay.
And she says, okay, Alex, tell me the first English sentence that pops into your head when you hear the word rain.
Okay.
And without overthinking it, he says, rain is beautiful.
A simple sentence.
That's a starting point, right?
Yeah.
He's already thinking directly in English.
Yeah.
Then she encourages him to elaborate a little bit. She's like, okay, build on that.
Yeah.
What else comes to mind?
Okay.
And he comes up with, I love the sound of rain when it falls on my window at night.
Oh, that's nice.
Right.
So he's gone from a very simple sentence to something a little more
More complex,
right?
more descriptive. And that's the key. It's about gradually building up the complexity. You're not trying to have these deep philosophical conversations in English right away.
Right. You're not jumping into like a college lecture in English.
Yeah.
You're starting with those basic associations and then slowly adding layers.
Yeah. And by doing that, you're training your brain to create these direct links between concepts and the English words and phrases that express them.
So essentially cutting out that middleman of translation.
Exactly. It's about reducing the cognitive load.
Yeah.
the mental effort that it takes to speak, because translating adds to that load and it makes it harder to speak fluently.
Interesting. So we're starting to think in English. What's the next technique that Sophie recommends?
So the next one might sound a little strange at first. It's the speak out loud to yourself method.
Okay. So like self-talk.
Exactly, talking to yourself in English.
And I can already hear some people listening being like,
Yeah.
won't people think I'm crazy?
Chuckles. Well, Alex has the exact same thought. He's like, talk to myself. Won't that make me look crazy?
Yeah, it's that natural reaction, isn't it?
It is. But Sophie reassures him that this is a very common and effective technique. It's something that a lot of successful language learners do.
Okay, so she normalizes it for him. And then how does she explain like how to actually do it?
She gives this really practical example. She's like, imagine you're making a cup of tea. As you're doing it, you describe your actions out loud in English. Now I'm taking the kettle. Next, I will add water.
Okay, I can see that. I can see that working.
Yeah, it's so simple, but it's really smart because you're using these everyday routines, these familiar scenarios, to practice constructing English sentences in real time.
And it's low pressure. No one's around to judge you.
Exactly. It's a safe space to experiment, to make mistakes, and to really get your mouth and brain working together to produce English.
Okay, so we're thinking in English. We're having these little English conversations with ourselves. What's next?
Okay, so the next strategy is called the shadowing technique. Have you ever tried this one?
I have given it a go.
Yeah.
I'll admit it felt a bit weird at first, but I could definitely see how it could be helpful.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things that feels a bit strange initially, but it can be really powerful.
Okay, so for those who haven't heard of it, what is shadowing?
So shadowing involves listening to a native English speaker. And as they're speaking, you're repeating what they're saying almost simultaneously. Like your voice is a shadow following theirs.
Okay.
So you're trying to mimic their pronunciation, their rhythm, their intonation.
And what are the benefits of doing that?
Sophie highlights a few key areas. So first, it helps with pronunciation, which is something a lot of learners struggle with.
Yeah.
And it also improves fluency because you're getting used to the natural flow of English speech. And it can even improve your intonation, which is the rise and fall of your voice when you speak. Is what gives English its musicality, and it conveys a lot of meaning.
So you're not just learning the words, you're learning how to say them like a native speaker.
Exactly. You're training your ear to pick up on those subtle nuances of pronunciation and intonation.
Okay, and how do you actually practice shadowing?
So you can use a variety of materials like English podcasts, YouTube videos, TED Talks, anything where you have clear audio of a native speaker speaking.
Okay.
And the key is to choose content where the speaker has clear pronunciation and their accent is relatively standard.
Right, so you're not trying to shadow someone who has a really strong regional dialect that even native speakers might find difficult to understand.
Exactly.
Okay.
So you play a sentence or a short segment, you pause it, and then you try to repeat it as accurately as possible, paying attention to their speed, their tone, their emphasis.
I like how Sophie gives an example of this to Alex. She says the sentence, "I love learning new things every day."
Yeah, she does that to demonstrate it. And she has Alex repeat it. And she encourages him to try and match her speed and the emphasis that she puts on certain words.
It's like she's giving him a little mini lesson in how to actually shadow.
Exactly. It's a really nice way to make the technique more concrete.
Okay, so we've got thinking in English, we've got self-talk, we've got shadowing.
Right.
What's next?
Okay, so the next one might make some people cringe a little bit. It's recording yourself speaking.
Oh, yeah. I can see why some people wouldn't be too keen on that.
Yeah, Alex definitely has that reaction.
Yeah.
He's like, I hate hearing my own voice. And to be honest, most of us do.
It's that instant playback.
Yeah, and it can be quite jarring to hear yourself the way others hear you.
But Sophie really stresses the value of doing it. Why is it so important?
Because it gives you this incredible insight into areas where you can improve that you might not even be aware of while you're speaking.
Right.
Because when you're in the moment of speaking, you're focused on getting the words out. You're not necessarily paying attention to your pronunciation, your grammar, all the little details.
You're just trying to survive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when you listen back, you can be more objective. You can pinpoint those mistakes or those areas where your speech sounds less natural.
And what kind of things does she recommend recording? It's not like we have to prepare these big formal speeches every time, is it?
No, not at all. She gives some really practical ideas like recording a short diary entry every day, just talking about your day, or practicing a short speech on a topic that you find interesting, or even having these imaginary conversations with yourself like you're talking to someone else.
Oh, like role playing.
Exactly. Role playing different scenarios.
Okay. And as you get used to hearing your own voice, it probably becomes less cringeworthy over time.
I think so. It becomes less about judgment and more about self-assessment and recognizing your progress.
Okay, so we've covered quite a few techniques already. What else does Sophie recommend?
Okay, so this next one is really interesting, and it kind of takes advantage of the technology that we have available now. She suggests practicing with AI or voice assistants.
Okay, so things like Google Assistant or Alexa.
Exactly, or even more advanced AI like ChatGPT. Alex mentioned Siri as well.
Right.
Which just shows how integrated these tools have become in our lives.
Yeah.
And the idea is that you can use these tools to practice your speaking even when you're alone.
But how does that actually work? It's not like having a real conversation with another person, is it?
It's not a perfect replacement for human interaction, but it does give you a low-pressure environment to practice forming questions and making statements in English.
Okay.
You can ask these AIs about all sorts of things, and they'll respond in English, which creates a sense of conversational flow.
Okay.
And it's actually a really good way to practice your pronunciation too.
Yeah.
Because if the AI doesn't understand what you're saying,
right,
it gives you immediate feedback that you might need to work on your clarity.
So it's kind of like having a really patient conversation partner.
Yeah, exactly. One that's always available and never gets tired of listening to you practice.
Okay, so that's a really cool way to use technology to your advantage. What's next on the list?
Okay, so the next technique is something that's been around for a long time, but it's still really effective. It's reading aloud.
Okay, a lot of people read in English, but Sophie really emphasizes the aloud part. What makes that so important?
Because reading silently is mostly about comprehension, understanding what you're reading. But reading aloud actively engages your mouth and your vocal cords.
Right.
You're forced to pronounce the words. You're paying attention to the rhythm and flow of the sentences.
So it's not just about understanding the words on the page, it's about actually producing those sounds.
Exactly. It's about bridging that gap between the written word and the spoken word.
And what kind of things should you be reading aloud?
Pretty much anything in English, news articles, books, social media posts, anything that catches your interest. The key is to read clearly and naturally.
Right.
Don't just sound out the words like a robot.
Right. It's about finding that natural conversational tone even when you're reading.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're thinking in English, we're talking to ourselves, we're shadowing, we're recording ourselves, we're chatting with AI, we're reading aloud. What else is there?
Okay, so the last tip that Sophie gives is about vocabulary. And it's not just about memorizing lists of words. It's about learning words in context. Alex mentions that he often learns new words, but then he struggles to remember them or use them correctly.
Yeah, that's such a common problem. It's like you have this big vocabulary list in your head, but you don't know how to actually use the words.
Exactly. And so Sophie's solution is to learn vocabulary in phrases rather than as individual words.
Oh, that's interesting. Can you give an example?
Yeah, she uses the word beautiful. So instead of just memorizing the definition of beautiful,
right,
she suggests learning it in a phrase like, what a beautiful sunset.
Okay, so you're not just learning the word itself, you're learning how to actually use it in a sentence.
Exactly. Yeah. You're learning the collocations, the words that naturally go together.
So you're learning grammar as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this makes it so much easier to remember the word and use it correctly.
Okay, so that's a really useful tip. And finally, Sophie introduces a technique that sounds like it could be a lot of fun.
You're talking about imitating different emotions and situations, right?
Yeah, it's like acting practice, but for language learning.
Yeah, exactly.
So what kind of scenarios does she recommend trying?
She gives examples like pretending you're in a restaurant and saying, "Excuse me, can I see the menu, please?" with that polite tone that you would use in a restaurant.
Okay.
Or imagine you're at the airport and you need to ask, "Where is the check-in counter?"
Yeah.
You practice saying that with that slightly questioning inflection.
So you're putting yourself in those situations and practicing the phrases that you would actually use.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It helps you feel more prepared and confident when you encounter those situations in real life.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. Sophie's given us so many great techniques to improve our speaking skills, even when we don't have a partner.
And her final message to Alex is really inspiring. She says, the key to fluency is consistent practice. You don't need a partner. You just need commitment.
I love that. I think that's a great takeaway for all of us.
It is. It's empowering to know that we have the power to improve our speaking skills on our own.
Okay, so for our final thought today, I challenge everyone listening to pick just one of these techniques that really resonated with you and try it out today.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Even just for 5 minutes. Think about the situations where you feel most nervous or hesitant when you have to speak English. Maybe it's ordering food at a restaurant. Maybe it's asking for directions. Maybe it's just making small talk with someone. Use Sophie's imitation technique to mentally rehearse those scenarios. And even better, actually act them out. Speak the words out loud.
Yeah, the more you practice, the more confident you'll become.
Exactly. And remember, every little bit of practice helps, even those 5 minutes here and there.
Absolutely. It all adds up. Over time, you'll start to see those improvements in your fluency and your confidence.
And that's what we all want, right?
Exactly, to feel comfortable and confident speaking English in any situation.
Okay, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.